Deborra-Lee finally breaks silence on Hugh Jackman's wedding. She's heartbroken. For almost 3 decades, Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee Furness looked like one of those Hollywood couples who had somehow figured it out. Then, almost overnight, the picture changed. What happened after their divorce, especially as Hugh's relationship with Sutton Foster became public, made people look back at their marriage very differently. And Deborra-Lee's eventual use of one word, betrayal, made the story even more complicated. I think that word matters. Because when Hugh and Deborra-Lee announced their separation in September 2023, there was no public war. No accusations. No dramatic television interview. Just a carefully written statement about moving in different directions and pursuing individual growth. For a couple who had been together for roughly 27 years, it was remarkably restrained. But Deborra-Lee stayed quiet. And that silence became part of the story. She wasn't out there trying to destroy Hugh's reputation. She wasn't giving interview after interview explaining what went wrong. She seemed to be doing something much harder. She was trying to live through it privately. And then Hugh's relationship with Sutton Foster became increasingly visible. That is where the old timeline suddenly became much more interesting. Hugh and Sutton had worked together on Broadway's The Music Man. They rehearsed together. Performed together. Did interviews together. Spent enormous amounts of time around each other. That's normal for 2 Broadway leads. But later, reports claimed their relationship had become much closer than a professional friendship. And once Hugh and Deborra-Lee separated, every old photograph and interview suddenly seemed to get another meaning. I find that part fascinating because it shows how quickly public perception can change. Something that looked completely innocent in 2022 can look very different when you're looking backward from 2025. But looking different isn't the same thing as proving what happened. And that's an important distinction. There have been reports alleging that Hugh and Sutton became romantically involved before the separation became public. Those claims have circulated widely, but the complete private timeline has never been established publicly by the people involved. So there is still a large gap between what has been reported and what we actually know. What we do know is that Sutton later filed for divorce from her husband, Ted Griffin, in October 2024. Then Hugh and Sutton began appearing together publicly. And eventually, the relationship was no longer something people could easily dismiss as simple Broadway friendship. For Deborra-Lee, though, the hardest part may not have been seeing Hugh move on. After nearly 3 decades together, either person was eventually going to have another chapter. The painful part, according to reports about her feelings, was the timing and what she believed had happened before the marriage ended. That's where her word, betrayal, carries so much weight. Because we grew apart is one thing. Betrayal is something else entirely. And yet she didn't immediately explain everything. That restraint is easy to overlook. Imagine having millions of strangers discussing your marriage while you know there are parts of the story they don't know. You could correct them. You could fight back. You could tell everyone your side. Deborra-Lee largely didn't. In 2024, when asked what the difficult period had taught her, she focused on something much more personal. She said she had discovered that she was strong. That she was resilient. That answer stayed with me. Because she wasn't talking about Hugh. She wasn't talking about Sutton. She was talking about herself. And that may have been the beginning of a very different chapter. To understand why the breakup carried so much emotional weight, you have to go all the way back to before Hugh Jackman was Wolverine. Before Hollywood knew his name. Before the enormous houses, red carpets, and global fame. Deborra-Lee already had an acting career. She had trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and had built professional experience before meeting Hugh on the Australian television series Corelli. Hugh was only 27. Deborra-Lee was 40. She was already more established professionally. And according to accounts from their early relationship, she wasn't immediately convinced that dating a younger man was a good idea. Hugh apparently didn't have the same hesitation. The relationship moved quickly. They married in 1996. And then Hugh's career exploded. X-Men changed everything. Wolverine turned him into an international star. But while Hugh was becoming one of Hollywood's most recognizable faces, Deborra-Lee was living a life that the public saw far less of. They dealt with fertility struggles. IVF. Miscarriages. Eventually, they chose adoption. They adopted Oscar, followed by their daughter Ava. Deborra-Lee also became an advocate for adoption reform and continued pursuing work of her own. So when people later reduced the marriage to Hugh Jackman's wife, they were missing a huge part of her identity. She had her own career, her own causes, her own story. And she had spent decades building a family alongside Hugh. That's why the ending couldn't possibly feel like just another celebrity breakup. It represented almost an entire adult lifetime. 27 years is a long time. Long enough to build traditions, raise children, buy homes, change careers, watch each other succeed, watch each other struggle, and eventually realize that the life you built together may no longer be the life you're going to continue living. Then, in June 2025, their divorce was finalized. And suddenly Hugh's relationship with Sutton Foster was no longer simply a rumor surrounding two Broadway performers. It was part of Hugh's new life. Reports later claimed that Hugh had proposed to Sutton during a vacation in Costa Rica. But that engagement claim has not been publicly established by the couple themselves, so it should be treated as reporting rather than confirmed fact. Still, the reports were enough to create a new wave of attention. And for someone who had just spent nearly 3 decades married to Hugh, seeing stories about another wedding would understandably be emotional. But there's something else I keep coming back to. Deborra-Lee didn't spend those years publicly trying to make Hugh look bad. Even after the separation, she didn't immediately tell the world everything. She waited. She processed. And eventually, she began describing the experience in stronger terms. A traumatic journey. A deep wound. Betrayal. Those words don't tell us the entire story. But they tell us something about how she experienced it. And that distinction matters. Because nobody outside that marriage knows every conversation that happened behind closed doors. We don't know every private decision. We don't know exactly when their relationship changed. And we shouldn't pretend anonymous reports can answer those questions. But perhaps Deborra-Lee doesn't need to give the world every detail. Maybe speaking at all, after years of silence, was enough. For decades, Hugh Jackman and Deborra-Lee Furness represented something people wanted to believe about Hollywood marriage. That two people could meet young, survive fame, raise a family, endure professional pressure, and grow old together. Then the marriage ended. And suddenly, the public had to accept that the picture we saw was never the entire picture. That's probably the hardest part of celebrity relationships. We see the photographs, the anniversaries, the smiles, the interviews. But we don't see the private conversations after the cameras turn off. Deborra-Lee may eventually tell more of that story herself. There have been reports that she has considered writing about the marriage and its aftermath. If she does, that could be the first time we hear her version without a red carpet, a press release, or someone else's headline standing between her and the story. And honestly, that's the part I'd be most interested in. Not the gossip. Not the next wedding. Not who moved on first. But what it feels like to lose nearly 30 years of your life as you knew it, and then discover that you're still strong enough to build something completely different. Because perhaps the real story isn't that Deborra-Lee is simply heartbroken. Perhaps it's that she's finally speaking from a place where she no longer needs to protect the image of the marriage. For years, the world knew Hugh Jackman's love story. Now, slowly, we're beginning to hear Deborra-Lee Furness's side of it. And whatever the full truth turns out to be, that story belongs to her.